I'm so excited to be talking about our shared passion about Celtic Christianity and its roots that go back to the earliest centuries. And I think that you and I have this shared passion for this hidden story. And I've been thinking of this story like Ariadne's thread that can lead us through the darkness, and that when we find one clue and we follow it and we follow it and we find ourselves then on a labyrinth that takes us to all these fascinating places. And I love the places that you have gone in your own mind, in your own studies, in your own learning. And I would just love for you to say a little bit, if you would, about New Eden Ministry, because I'm so delighted that Mythica is going to be partnering with you in one of the upcoming Blessing Thread pilgrimages as we go to the Celtic Islands. And the depth of study that you have brought to this subject is really magnificent.
Well, thank you. Yeah. So New Eden Ministry is my own little, it was a hobby at first, which now has become something that I'm actually able to just do full time, which makes it much more fun and lovely and exciting. And I was a seminarian with the United Church of Canada. And while I love a lot of things about the United Church, it just is a very active and not contemplative church. And I felt very much called to the contemplative life. And so even though I had a church for a couple of years and it went really well and I loved it, I didn't finish seminary, and I decided to sort of go my own sort of semi-monastic kind of direction. But I still had very much this call to preaching, which is something I've always loved to do, to preach and to write. And I didn't know what to do with it. So I just started taking my old sermons and turning them into blog posts to see if anyone was interested. And from there it grew. And we have an online community now of, it's hard to give exact numbers, but hundreds of people who are active anyway.
And thousands of subscribers.
Yeah, thousands of subscribers for sure. Yeah. And we are centered around Celtic Christianity, but with a love for all mysticism, particularly Christian, but also whatever is wise and insightful. But centered around Celtic Christianity and contemplation and nature and all those wonderful things that I know you also love.
Great. Yeah. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit just about, for most people, the name Pelagius is a head scratcher. They probably never heard of it before. The few people who've encountered it in seminary are often want to say, oh, isn't that some sort of heretic? And yet I think if you could, in a 20-second soundbite, summarize what Pelagius is for you. And then we'll talk about how that weaves in with the Celtic braid of this great Blessing Thread tradition.
20 seconds for Pelagius. Okay. I might go as far as 45, we'll see.
Okay.
So I was first drawn to Pelagius because of his Celtic connection. I mean, if you study Celtic theology, you're going to come into Pelagius.
And that's St. Morgan, by the way, in Wales, for those of you who are listening.
Yeah, and he's most famous for his arguments with Augustine. And I often say this to people, I like to read Pelagius for what he had to say for himself and what was important to him, as opposed to just why he pissed off Augustine. Because a lot of people pissed off Augustine and Jerome, and that's not actually anything special. But he had a beautiful teaching, which was perhaps not as philosophical as Augustine, and that's why they didn't see eye to eye. It's more practical, it's more sort of earthy, but it's deep and it's profound and it's well thought and it's thoroughly rooted in the scriptures. And it's based in the notion of the goodness of creation, and in particular, the goodness of humanity. And Pelagius has this very high view of humanity, and that we have an untapped potential within us that is waiting, patiently waiting perhaps to be realized and utilized and brought into fruition. And that is really the goal of the Christian life. And most of his teachings are actually about how to do that rather than the theology of what is around it. And so he's very much an ascetic teacher and a monastic teacher, and he talks about the vices and the virtues and fasting and prayer and all these kinds of wonderful things, but he has a very gentle spirit with it, unlike a lot of other Celtic ascetic teachers who could sometimes be very harsh. Pelagius was very, very gentle with one of my favorite quotes of his. He says, the body needs to be controlled and not broken. So Yeah,
And
that's
in one of your writings, you talked about bees and flowers and nectars. Could you share that part of Pelagius here too?
yeah, that's actually teaching from Cassian, and not from Pelagius, but
Oh,
Pelagius and Cassian have a lot of overlap and weren't too far apart in time or thought. But the idea of Cassian and his conferences is that spiritual community is like a garden or like an orchard, and that we all have different flowers. We all have different spiritual flowers that bloom within us, and that the wise spiritual person should be like a bee who doesn't gather all of their nectar from one flower, but instead visits every flower in the garden and takes what it needs from them and gathers it together in the honeycomb of the heart.
I love that. And that the image that you see behind me is actually the mountain in La Sainte Baume in Provence, where John Cassian prayed and meditated and actually wrote that book. So, and what you're describing about the honeycomb of the heart in gathering flower from the nectar, I think that that's just a beautiful description of what Mirabai Starr refers to as interspirituality of gathering those traditions. And so just like that Celtic braid, those are the things that we'll be weaving together when at the end of January, when you join our faculty at Mythica, and we're going to do the Blessing Thread pilgrimage. So our first pilgrimage is to the mountain behind me where Cassian wrote the institutes and the conferences, and where the cave of Mary Magdalene is. According to French legend, that's where she spent the last 30 years of her life in contemplative practice that then becomes the foundation of the hidden root of Celtic monasticism in so many ways. We're going to be tracing this journey that goes from Provence, and one of the little known facts is that even St. Patrick himself, who's widely credited as being the founder of Celtic Christianity in Ireland, that he actually came to Provence to become a monk. And it was here in France then that he learned some of the traditions of psalm chanting, for example, that he carries with him to Ireland. So our first journey will be here, but then our second journey, Justin's going to join us. And in particular, he's going to talk about that wise and gentle and slightly heretical figure, Pelagius, who calls us to the memory of the goodness inside of us. And I think one of the things that so resonates with me as this thread that connects these two traditions then is, if we go to the Magdalene tradition and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which was only recovered again in really in our lifetime and translated, there's this emphasis on returning to the root. And it says, this is why the good, with a capital G, this is why the good has come into your midst to reunite you with your roots. And that's very much in the spirit of the Celtic tradition, to reunite us with that essential goodness that you were just talking about in this vision. And how do we do that? And so part of our journey together is going to introduce some of these contemplative practices of art making and labyrinth walking and Lectio Divina and Visio Divina and silent prayer. And so we'll start the Blessing Thread pilgrimages in La Baume with Mary Magdalene and with John Cassian and with the early monastic traditions that were founded here. And then we'll follow them to the Celtic Isles. We'll go to Wales, and then we'll go to Ireland, and we'll encounter those holy hermits in places like Skellig Michael and the tradition of Bridget. Our second pilgrimage is just the day before Imbolc, and so we'll be celebrating the coming of spring. And then from there, we'll go to Iona in March and learn about that rich tradition with St. Columbus, St. Columba. And then from there to Lindisfarne and the Holy Gospels that were created of art there. And then back over to Glastonbury, down to the Pyrenees, over the Pyrenees to Spain, to Montserrat and the Block Madonnas. And then to the Rhineland in the fall, where we'll encounter Hildegard of Bingen and Meister Eckhart. And then we'll be finishing up the Blessing Thread pilgrimages in Italy with visits to the Sibylline Mountains, where St. Benedict grew grew up, and then of course over to Assisi to encounter St. Francis, St. Clare, and then the woman, the lay woman who's buried with Francis in his tomb that nobody knows about. And that is Lady Jacqueline de Settasoli Frangipani, truly one of the most delicious names and delicious stories that I know from the mystic tradition. So Justin, I'm so glad that you're going to be braiding your thread with us in this coming year. And I look forward to participating and following you every week on the virtual chapel and New Eden Ministries with all your writings.